when Maersk, the world's largest shipping firm, had essentially all of its computers destroyed and its network around the world. They just saw a wave of black screens go across the room, just black, 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 black. Tens of thousands of containers were arriving at this terminal and others around the world, and nobody knew what was on them. Hospitals across the United States had their digital medical record systems shut down. Had a nurse say, "We have a child who is due for surgery. We don't know if this child has had the necessary tests to do this life-saving procedure." That's the degree of crippled these companies were by this really almost like collateral damage of the cyber attack that spread from Ukraine.
As cyber warfare escalates to new heights, the line between virtual and reality blurs. Join me this week as I speak with Andy Greenberg. He's a leading investigative journalist on cybersecurity, and he's author of several best-selling books, including Sandworm, A New Era of Cyber War, and The Hunt for the Kremlin's Most Dangerous Hackers. We'll discuss the real-world consequences of cyber attacks. We also discuss the ways cryptocurrency fuels global hacking and online crime. In his latest book, Tracers in the Dark, Andy tells the fascinating story of a global law enforcement team that traced Bitcoin payments to take down Alpha Bay, the world's largest online criminal marketplace. All this week on Global Macro Update from Malden Economics. So Andy, it's really great to see you. Thanks for being with us here on Global Macro Update. I want to start out with I think what is the obvious, which is the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because unfortunately, a lot of people, I think here in the U.S., think that conflict started in 2022, but it really started a lot earlier than that. Well, historically, much, much earlier than that. But if you want to label this as one singular conflict, it started several years earlier, and you outline this in your book, Sandworm. It really started online, and it was a pretty vicious attack that was launched by Russia against the Ukraine. Can you just kind of introduce what that side of the conflict looked like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what you're getting at is that this war, I would say, truly began in 2014. I mean, Ukraine and Russia have had geopolitical conflicts of various kinds for 1,000 years, but
right.
But in 2014, Ukraine had a revolution, and it pulled away from Russia's sphere of influence, kind of like gave up all of those sort of post-Soviet ties and truly became an independent sort of West-looking country, I would say, for the first time. And Russia responded by invading then, and seized Crimea, occupied parts of Donbass, and sort of sparked a civil war there. But what I've always been focused on, I mean, I'm a reporter who covers hackers, of course, is the fact that they accompanied this physical invasion with, I would say, maybe the first ever full-blown cyber war we've seen in history, where Russian state-sponsored hackers were launching destructive attacks, like data-destroying attacks on the media, the finance industry, government agencies, sort of peaking, at least in a sort of initial wave, with the first ever blackout attack that was launched against the collection of electric utilities in the west of Ukraine. The first time that hackers ever turned off the lights for anyone in the world, but this was an attack on civilians in particular that caused a blackout for 250,000 Ukrainians, and they would do it again the next year, and then all of that led up to tell the kind of the whole arc of this to a piece of malware that was released by this one group of Russian hackers responsible for all of this, known as Sandworm, the subject of my book. They released this piece of malware called NotPetya. And NotPetya was this extremely virulent piece of malicious code that hit Ukraine, essentially carpet bombed the entire Ukrainian internet, and then spread worldwide to do $10 billion in global damage.
Yeah, when you say blackout, I mean, I really want to make sure people understand what life was like for a brief period of time in Ukraine. We're talking about no access to transactions of almost any type. So you walk into a store, your credit card, your debit card doesn't work. The lights might not even be on, right?
Those are two different things that we should be clear. There were these blackout attacks where they literally turned off the lights to thousands of people. The second time it was in the capital of Kyiv, and a fraction of the whole city lost power. But those were short, just like the first one was like 6 hours. The one in Kyiv actually only lasted an hour, thanks to I think to the kind of like very clever and resilient work of Ukrainians to turn the power back on. But then with NotPetya, that was, I would say, the true climactic attack where by destroying essentially all of the networks of the banking system in the country, the computers inside of pretty much every Ukrainian government agency, that's when essentially all credit card transactions went offline. ATMs were down around the country. Hospitals were paralyzed. The radioactivity monitoring at the Chernobyl station, were in fact reduced to offline, analog measurements. And ultimately, this is what this piece of malware, NotPetya, is what shut down all of those systems. Then spread around the world, shut down the world's largest shipping company, Maersk, FedEx, Mondelez, which owns Cadbury and Nabisco, Merck's pharmaceutical manufacturing in the United States, and ultimately then took out the electronic health records, the digital medical record systems of dozens of hospitals across the United States. The impact of NotPetya, you could say it's more like it's like a digital blackout. I think that's maybe what you were getting at. It's like and we've never seen anything like it before or since. Just a true scorched earth kind of cyber war attack.
So one of the interesting things in that section of the book was you talk about how certain sectors of the Ukrainian economy were able to bounce back relatively quickly by defaulting to analog practices. And yet here we are in this world that is becoming increasingly more and more digital. And I don't think a lot of people realize just how dependent we are on digital. And just one little example, a few days ago, I left my cell phone in a taxi. Right, in another country. and so I've been without a cell phone for a few days, waiting for it to be returned to me. And just that one little glitch and having to find my way home from an airport in New York City back to Connecticut without Google Maps, for example, was it was an inconvenience, but it also just kind of rammed home because of some of the prep that I've been doing here. Like, what if that happened to everybody? And like there would be gridlock. And then you took it in the book several steps farther where you talk about some of the systems that are so sophisticated that there is no analog fallback. The whole system collapses.
Right. I mean, we just talked about the the literal blackout attacks. Excuse me. That hit Ukraine, where these Ukrainian electric utilities essentially had the power switched off, but they were, accustomed enough to the failure of their power system in Ukraine that they had people ready to jump into trucks and go manually switch the power back on. The United States grid is much more automated, and that I think is, and we may not have, in fact, the kind of manual fail safes for our systems that they do in our electric utilities. But that's just kind of one example. I mean, the Ukrainian postal system also, for instance, which is responsible for the delivery of newspapers, but also and magazines and the media, but also the pension system in Ukraine. They actually distribute like cash to Ukrainian retirees around the country. That's a really important lifeline. Was completely the digital element of it was completely destroyed by NotPetya, but there were still people in the Ukrainian postal service, Ukroposhta, who still remembered how to do this with paper alone. They still had paper filing systems. They still had, collections of thousands of little paper cards that told, everybody like how much money was owed to whom, and they were able to fall back to that. I'm not sure that we in the United States still have those analog fallbacks, and it's, in a way, it is, I think, and I do end the book with this kind of lesson that perhaps we do need to keep one foot in the analog past in this way, as if we don't really want, I think, to run out over the precipice into a fully digital world before we're sure that we can actually, protect that world from this kind of cyber attack.
Again, a lot of people feel terrible about what's happening in Ukraine, and some people are taking action to try and help. But still, I get the sense that that could happen there, but it could never happen here. What is your feeling on could this happen here? What is the state of cyber warfare today, and who are the most active players in that arena?
Yeah, I do think that most cyber war stories have always been like what could happen, or like some hypothetical dystopian future. I started telling the Ukrainian story to say, like, look what happened in Ukraine, that could happen here. But before I'd even finished this book, in fact, like, I published a Wired cover story that was sort of about like this notion that we could look to Ukraine to see what might happen to us in the United States. The same week that magazine arrived at subscribers' mailboxes is when NotPetya hit, and then suddenly it was happening here. Like, I'm not sure Americans were aware of this, but American companies certainly were. I documented it in my reporting how when Maersk, the world's largest shipping firm, had essentially all of its computers destroyed in its network around the world, and that literally looked for some people like they just saw a wave of black screens go across the room, just black, 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 as NotPetya destroyed every computer it touched. In like just spreading in seconds from machine to machine. At the same time, tens of thousands of trucks were lining up at 17 of Maersk's shipping terminals around the world. I mean, I documented this at the one in Newark, New Jersey, because I could like see it with binoculars from my office window in One World Trade Center. So I was sort of interested in that one. And I interviewed people there who talked about this line going miles and miles of trucks. And that is all because the digital systems of Maersk were simply dead. The company was brain dead. And that meant that these trucks were locked out of the ports where ships, the size of the Empire State Building with another Empire State Building's worth of cargo on top of them, on its side, basically, tens of thousands of containers were arriving at this terminal and others around the world, and nobody knew what was on them. I mean, that's the degree of I would say, like, totally crippled these companies were by this really almost like collateral damage of the cyber attack that spread from Ukraine. That's just one example that touched the United States, but Merck also had to shut down its pharmaceutical manufacturing to the degree that it had to borrow its own HPV vaccine from the Center for Disease Control. It had run out of supply, basically.
Wow.
And then I already mentioned how hospitals across the United States had their digital medical record systems shut down by this. It was actually because they used this one piece of software that was designed to do speech-to-text transcriptions of changes into patients' medical records. They didn't know that this system had failed. So doctors have been reading changes into patients' medical records, and only days later did they realize that all of those changes were missing. This had been a kind of silent failure. And I talked to an IT administrator, one hospital, who had a nurse run up to her like a couple of days after NotPetya hit and say, we have a child's patient who is due for surgery. We don't know if this child has had the necessary tests to do this life-saving procedure. So
wow.
we have to find, those missing changes. I mean, and this happens many times just for that one IT administrator. So then you multiply that out across, all of the hundreds of hospitals in the United States that were affected by this. And, it is absolutely something that has happened here. This Ukrainian cyber war, I think it was a Ukrainian like sort of epicenter. It nonetheless was like a phenomenon that affected us too. Although, in distributed ways where like some people felt it, but maybe not enough for it to be in the kind of the average person's awareness.
This effort from Russia was really aimed at Ukraine, and yet the impact was felt well beyond Ukraine. It sounds like perhaps unintentionally. This malware was essentially spread through an attachment on an email. Is that correct?
Well, not exactly. No, it was actually spread through this Ukrainian accounting software, and it was spread through the software updates of software. And this is the kind of like the TurboTax or Quicken of Ukraine, where it's called MEDOC. And basically everybody who does business in the country or files taxes in Ukraine has to have this software. Sandworm, the hackers that carried out all of this, this one group of Russian hackers who I eventually determined were part of the Russian military intelligence agency, the GRU, they hijacked the software updates of MEDOC, this accounting software, and used that to push out NotPetya to everybody who had that software installed everywhere in the world. So that meant that most of the victims were Ukrainian, but really if you even did business in Ukraine, like all of these companies did, you suddenly had an installation of NotPetya as well. That's what happened to Maersk, for instance. They had one computer running this accounting software in their Odessa office on the Black Sea coast of Ukraine. And that was enough for NotPetya to infect that computer and then spread to their entire global network. So in a way, yes, it does, you could describe it as collateral damage, but that's almost giving Sandworm too much credit that this was by accident, because they should have been well aware, and they probably were aware, that this technique of exploiting that accounting software would affect people worldwide. And they may have actually intended to sort of send a message: don't even do business in Ukraine, or you're going to be a target just like Ukraine is. Like, stay out of Ukraine. This is our country to mess with, essentially. And at the very least, like, I think it's, you could, even if it was an accident, then I think that points to a kind of just insane, brazen recklessness on the part of these hackers, who really made no effort, at least, to kind of limit the blast radius of this biggest ever in history cyber attack.
So then you fast forward to today, right? And certainly the U.S. as well as much of NATO is lending financial support and physical support in the form of weaponry to Ukraine. And I guess the big question is, how sophisticated is this division of the Russian military that deployed this cyber attack, and are they sophisticated enough to do it elsewhere? Could the Russians essentially open up a new front against the West in cyberspace?
Yeah, it's been very interesting to see how cyber war has played out as a kind of less limited, more like a full-blown invasion of Ukraine has taken place. I mean, in some ways, it seems like cyber war has kind of fallen by the wayside. I mean, I think some people predicted that there would be cyber attacks on a level we had never seen before, even in Ukraine, once the invasion began. And that didn't happen, in part, I think, because Russia's hackers were instead tasked with kind of more traditional espionage to try to support the war effort. Some people think Russia thought it was going to take over the Ukrainian infrastructure and governments and didn't want to destroy it. Other people, I have seen evidence, nonetheless, that Sandworm and other GRU, this Russian military intelligence agency's hackers, are carrying out a lot of cyber attacks in Ukraine, but they're very fast-paced and kind of simple and crude almost compared to what they were doing when they had sort of more time on their hands pre-invasion, and they could plan these attacks over sometimes years, in fact. So it almost seems like the GRU, these hackers, are now just kind of trying to keep up with the pace of an actual physical war, a war that, to be totally fair, like, I think just rightfully has the concerns about physical bombing and massacres of civilians just kind of eclipse any concerns about digital attacks. I think that's only appropriate because, these attacks, even the very worst of them, are just not as damaging as, and in fact, like, there's no need to use hackers to try to cause a blackout when you can just hit an electrical utility with a bomb. What we've seen so much of. But to answer your other question, I think a lot of people expected that when Russia was sanctioned and isolated and just, cut off from the global economy and just punished in every way that we could manage in the West, I think with good reason, for this invasion of Ukraine, that they would strike out and retaliate by carrying out cyber attacks on Western infrastructure, to whatever, just as a kind of just retaliation, lashing out, and anger.
Right.
And we haven't seen that, and we haven't seen much of it anyway. And I think that may in part just be because the Russian hackers are busy. They are like overwhelmed with the task of supporting the war effort, of carrying out destructive attacks in Ukraine, carrying out espionage to try to inform the Russian military. I think in many ways, this war, Putin has much more on his hands than he or anyone in the Kremlin expected, and the result is that it almost seems like the GRU doesn't have the bandwidth, so to speak, to be launching cyber attacks on the West when it is really just almost fighting for its survival in Ukraine.
Well, China's not overwhelmed at this point. The Iranians are not overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Have you looked into the other major global players in state-sponsored cyber warfare? Because if I recall from your book, the U.S. is one of the leaders in this space.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, with Sandworm, with the story of Sandworm, I was trying to show, I think, like one possible future where this kind of reckless, I would say unrestrained form of cyber war becomes commonplace, and the problem all along throughout the years that the GRU was carrying out these cyber attacks in Ukraine, some of which directly affected Americans, was that the U.S. government barely tried to restrain Russia, barely tried to punish or even send a message to the Russian government to cut it out. Like there were years, in fact, when these Russian hackers were turning off the lights in Ukraine, destroying, giant amounts of data inside of the Ukrainian government and private industry, and the U.S. government said nothing about it. Didn't even bother to say, like, these Sandworm hackers appear to be the Russian government, and probably you should cut that out. Nothing, because this was just sort of considered Ukraine's problem, and that I think did invite a sense of like, well, I guess there are no rules in this world. We can just do what we want, and that's what led to NotPetya. And I think it probably has to a certain degree unleashed hackers around the world to think that they can get away with this kind of thing. I do think that since the invasion of Ukraine, there's been a shift. In fact, even in the years before, where Russia has been held accountable more. I mean, Sandworm's hackers were actually indicted a year after my book came out. And 6 of them were named and put on an FBI most wanted poster. There's now a bounty on their heads.
Wow.
If they'll ever see the inside of a U.S. courtroom, almost certainly not. But now there does seem to be a kind of belated almost effort to rein in these, to try to hold hackers, to hold countries accountable for these most dangerous forms of cyber attack. Now, there, of course, I think that doesn't mean that, like, as you say, China, Iran, North Korea won't nonetheless launch these kinds of attacks. North Korea released another worm called NotPetya. WannaCry in 2017 that did almost as much damage as NotPetya. But North Korea is sort of interesting because their hackers, their state-sponsored hackers, are focused on theft and profits and ransomware, and that can sometimes be almost as dangerous as the kind of destructive hacking that Russia has carried out. China has been focused largely on espionage, but then is sort of tinkering or experimenting a bit with destructive attacks as well, including in Taiwan. I think where we really should be keeping an eye on what's happening. Iran has carried out destructive attacks on a smaller scale, and I think continues to. So no, I mean this, and I think also to your point, all of this began in a sense with the use of Stuxnet, a U.S. Israeli co-created piece of malicious code designed to destroy equipment in an underground nuclear enrichment facility in Iran. That was an American and Israeli intelligence kind of incredible invention, Stuxnet, this piece of malware that could destroy physical equipment to try to slow Iran's nuclear weapons effort. But it did, I think, begin this arms race that continues today, and that toothpaste, cannot be put back in the tube.
Do you think we're doing enough in this country, Andy, to safeguard ourselves? I had a conversation with the former presidential candidate Andrew Yang a few weeks ago, and him and I talked about this. Much of that conversation was off camera, but he was disappointed. He offered his services to help out with modernizing U.S. technology, government technology. And the response that he got was that he felt like the government or the new administration at the time just didn't feel it was a high priority. And yet, very recently, granted only for a few hours, all airplane traffic in the United States was grounded because one of our software systems that's critical to the safety of coordinating flights, domestic flights, completely failed. And from what I understand or what I know now, it basically failed because the system is old and antiquated, which seems like a huge risk to me in this new world of cyber warfare.
Absolutely. I mean, I do think that we in the United States we probably lack the kind of resilience and analog fail-safes that I talked about. We have like incredible interdependencies that you could see just, for instance, in the fact that we depend on speech to text software to have changes to our medical record systems across the United States that could be taken out by one piece of malware. And then suddenly there are patients with dangerously incomplete medical records in hospitals across the country. I mean, we've seen this already. And I don't know if like you can blame an administration for this or not, for that. It's like almost just the nature of digital systems is that it is very difficult to avoid interdependencies and complexities and vulnerabilities. I do think that the creation of CISA, CISA, the Cyber Infrastructure and Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, was one step to trying to like get our arms around this problem in the U.S. In this country. But it's an almost impossible task. And what I wanted to kind of emphasize in the book is that you need a kind of diplomacy and system of norms and almost like a Geneva Convention for cyber war on top of all of these attempts to be resilient and defend ourselves. We need like a system of rules where we just try to prevent state-sponsored actors from doing the most dangerous and reckless and destructive things. I mean, we don't just lock our doors. We also make it illegal to break into somebody's home. And if they do, and you've got to catch them and make them face the consequences.
You touched on another topic that I wanted to chat with you about when you mentioned North Korea's approach to hacking is somewhat different and maybe more focused on things like ransomware. And that gets into cryptocurrency, which has been used online to facilitate the payment to hackers. And I think the misconception of hackers was that they could stay anonymous, right? If you got paid in Bitcoin or whatever cryptocurrency they're asking for, that it would remain anonymous. And in your latest book, Tracers in the Dark, which is, I just can't recommend that book highly enough. I could not put it down. It's riveting. It gets into that fallacy of cryptocurrency being not being traceable. Like it in fact is. It's not easy, but it can be traced. What led you in that direction, and what got you interested in that story?
Yeah, that's actually a story that I, in some ways, was interested in and covering years before I started looking into Ukraine or cyber war. Back in 2011, I wrote I think it was the first print magazine piece about Bitcoin for Forbes magazine, and Bitcoin was worth $1 at the time. Unfortunately, I did not buy any, but that was in part because
like me, you didn't take a $20 flyer, and you're not a multimillionaire now.
I actually tried to put about $40 into it, but there was a bug in the exchange I was using, and I gave up very quickly. That $40 would be a couple of years later. Anyway, let's not think too much about it. But yes. I was interested though, and what I heard about Bitcoin at the time was that what I was told by some of the first Bitcoin developers that made me interested in it was that it was essentially untraceable, that it was an anonymous digital cash for the internet. And even Satoshi Nakamoto, this mysterious creator of Bitcoin, who I actually even reached out to for that first piece, he or she or whoever they are, had not yet even disappeared from web forums and things at the time. Even Satoshi Nakamoto had written in this email introducing Bitcoin that to a cryptography mailing list that participants can be anonymous. So, I really believe that, and I think a lot of people did think that Bitcoin was this way to kind of put unmarked bills in a briefcase and send it across the internet without revealing anything about your identity. And I was interested in the ways that this was going to unlock a new world of money laundering and online drug deals and human trafficking and terrorist financing and who knows what. And a lot of that came to pass. I mean, a lot of that happened over the next few years, the middle of the last decade. Flashing forward to about 2020, I began to realize just how wrong I had been about Bitcoin. That in fact, the blockchain, this ledger of all Bitcoin transactions, actually made Bitcoin incredibly traceable. And I began to see that the Department of Justice was crediting actually this one company, Chainalysis, in one of their releases after another, and essentially using cryptocurrency tracing as this incredibly powerful investigative technique to solve all sorts of crimes. And that's when I started looking into that world of cryptocurrency tracing, and I found this kind of small group of detectives that had first in the research world and then the tech industry and then finally in law enforcement had gone on this kind of incredible years-long spree of just tracing and busting many of the biggest operations in the cyber criminal underworld. Every case was bigger than the last, and that is the story of this book, Tracers in the Dark, and it's really about, in some sense, the trap that cryptocurrency represented for a lot of people seeking financial privacy, but also cyber criminals who thought that they were anonymous and untraceable using this coin, when in fact it was more possible to follow the money and catch them than ever before.
So I was introduced to the Tracers in the Dark story through Wired magazine. I've been a subscriber for a long time. It's one of my regular reads. And you released a 6-part series. And Tracers in the Dark is really the story of the founder and manager of Alpha Bay. Alpha Bay being a notorious online drug and illegal activity marketplace. And you write in just fascinating detail the story of how this guy, who was not in the U.S. or not even in North America, how they find him, how they identify him, and how they trace back payments to him, and ultimately through this amazing international coordinated effort, take him down.
Yeah, Alpha Bay.
So go ahead.
In some ways, I would say it was maybe the pinnacle of a kind of cryptocurrency black market economy on the dark web. Many people have heard of the Silk Road. That was the first dark web market to kind of integrate Bitcoin as its main form of payment, because people thought it was anonymous and untraceable. And eventually, so the Silk Road was taken down before anybody really even realized just how traceable Bitcoin was. But Alpha Bay then took its place eventually, and by 2017 had grown to be 10 times the size of the Silk Road, was doing eventually millions of dollars in drug deals and fraud sales and stolen data transactions a day, and became the biggest dark web drug market, mostly in history. And perhaps by some measures still the biggest dark web black market we've ever seen. And it was all run by this one mysterious guy named who called himself Alpha 02. And for a long time, nobody could figure out who that was. And it almost seemed like Alpha 02 might be the kind of untouchable kingpin of the dark web, who was always going to stay a step ahead beyond the reach of law enforcement. And that did change. I mean, the first time, the first kind of crack in that mystery of of who Alpha O2 was actually came from a tip to, of all places, the Fresno DEA office. It came from this security, or an anonymous tipster. I still actually don't even know myself who sent this tip, but apparently in the very first days that Alphabet was online, years earlier, it's forums, it's user forums for just sharing, discussion about what was happening on Alphabet. When you registered for it, you would get this welcome email that included in the metadata of the email this email address, pimpalex91@hotmail.com. It turns out that was the email address of Alexander Caz, this French-Canadian guy who had apparently moved to Bangkok and eventually would be revealed to be Alpha O2. He had become this millionaire drug kingpin living in Bangkok with his Thai wife. But that was still kind of unproven initially, and even the prosecutors who got this tip and the DEA agents thought it was almost too good to be true, that perhaps Caz was being set up by the real Alpha O2. And the way that they made their case and the way that they truly proved Caz's identity as the kingpin of Alphabet was by coming up with some very clever ways, along with Chainalysis, this cryptocurrency tracing company that I mentioned, to follow the money and prove that it was Alexander Caz who was cashing out the millions of dollars in revenue that he was receiving as the creator of Alphabet. So it was, in fact, cryptocurrency tracing that would identify him as Alpha O2, that would lead to his downfall. There was another kind of very interesting secret technique that Chainalysis used, along with the IRS, that I sort of detail in the book, to locate the Alphabet server, which was a huge part of the case. And this is what led to this kind of, I think, as you described, this elaborate sting operation to take down Caz in Bangkok.
Yeah, that was kind of the most amazing aspect of the book from my perspective, being somewhat cynical when it comes to government competence. Not only was there incredible coordination domestically across agencies and jurisdictions, but internationally, across multiple countries, there was coordination, and there was a private sector element as well. All came together to make this happen. Just really remarkable.
Yeah.
And impressive.
I mean, there were I think a lot of close calls and mistakes that almost led to disasters, but then they sort of squeaked by to pull off this incredible thing, which is that they took down Alphabet, in fact, at the same time as the Dutch police took over the second biggest dark web drug market and ran it in secret, so that all of Alphabet's refugee drug dealers, essentially, when Alphabet was torn offline, fled into this other market, Hansa it was called, that was under Dutch police control secretly. Anyway, that's a complicated story I'll leave for the book. But, the takedown of Caz, for instance, was this incredibly well-coordinated thing. It involved 9 undercover agents all positioned around his home on this cul-de-sac in the outskirts of Bangkok. And, they had one person pretending to be an electrician, working on a wiring box. One person was pretending to be a gardener. These 2 women were in this Toyota Camry, and they'd driven it down as if they had taken a wrong turn into this cul-de-sac. And anyway, but it all began basically with this other team in Lithuania that was supposed to wiretap essentially the Alphabet server, accidentally causing it to crash, just as they were just preparing to do the takedown. They wanted to capture Caz logged into that server before carrying out this elaborate arrest. The challenge of the arrest really is that they knew he had full disk encryption on his laptop. If he just closed the lid of that laptop, then all of his evidence and secrets would be locked in it forever. And so they had to get the laptop open. They knew that he never opened it outside of his home, but they also wanted to get him logged into the server. But then they crashed the server. So that was the beginning of the whole operation. And so they did nonetheless pull this off. I don't know if you want to tell how much of the story you want to tell, but yeah, there were mishaps and the kind of I don't know, curveballs that you would expect from something this complex, being run by half a dozen government agencies around the world simultaneously. All of that
there were so many curveballs, and it was so riveting that if I didn't know the history of the book and what you were trying to do, I would have sworn, I would have bet that it was fiction, because it read like the best riveting thriller you can imagine. So, I mean, I just in terms of story and narrative, it's one of the best books I've read all year. So, I mean, I can't congratulate you enough on not just unveiling the truth behind traceability, but making it super fun. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's a story that I first became aware of in 2017 when the Department of Justice announced the takedown of Alphabet. And in fact, the takedown of Alphabet and the takeover of Hansa, this incredible 1-2 punch operation that was called Operation Bayonet. And I really spent the 5 years since then trying to put that story together, and often like hitting dead ends. And only once I kind of began to work on this book about cryptocurrency tracing and found that element of the story did I really find like enough of the story to kind of convince all the people involved, like, oh, this guy's got like a big chunk of this story. Let's work with him and tell the rest of it. And one source led to the next, and I was finally able to, I think, like tell the story from the perspective of everyone involved. I suppose with the exception of Alexander Kaz, who, you know, not to spoil the story, but died in a Thai jail cell mysteriously.
So what's next for you, Andy? Are you going to write the same type of book about FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried, or where are you going?
Well, I hear that Michael Lewis has that book already under wraps. So, like,
great timing on his part, right?
I'm not going to compete with him, but this cat and mouse game of cryptocurrency tracing and the people who still are trying to stay a step ahead and do criminal things with cryptocurrency, including those North Korean hackers you mentioned as we've gone on to this topic, that's still happening. And that world, that cat and mouse game continues. In fact, you mentioned FTX. You know, there's the story of FTX as a kind of whatever, I don't know, you could call it a Ponzi scheme perhaps, or a Lehman Brothers type meltdown. But then there's also, in fact, just as FTX declared bankruptcy, about $500 million of cryptocurrency was simply just like stolen out of their accounts. We don't know who took it. Could have been embezzled by Sam Bankman-Fried or other insiders. We don't know, but it could have also been external hackers who just seized upon this opportunity to pull off a big heist. And the cryptocurrency tracers, who are some of the central characters of my book, are following that money as we speak. And it will be very difficult for anybody to cash out that stolen loot in a usable way without being identified. And we will probably get an answer to that mystery. That's just one example of like the incredible stories that continue to unfold in this world. I mean, the other one is the Bitfinex case. I'm sure you probably even covered this story of a kind of Bonnie and Clyde, like New York couple who were accused of money laundering.
Yes.
And they allegedly, helped to launder 120,000 stolen Bitcoins, and were indicted this past year. And that story too was a story of cryptocurrency tracing carried out by some of the central characters of my book. It happens, it came to light just as I was finishing the book, so I sort of just mentioned it in the epilogue, but it resulted in the biggest seizure, not just of cryptocurrency, but of money of any kind in the history of the Department of Justice. So I can just see that like this is, it's really just the beginning of this story. I mean, I could write probably another whole book of cryptocurrency tracing stories if I wanted to, but regardless, I'll definitely be covering them for Wired.
Well, you're doing important work, both at Wired and with all of your books, the most recent being Tracers in the Dark. Before that, Sandworm, Andy Greenberg. So great speaking with you. I really appreciate the time. Take care.
No, I appreciate it. It's been fun.
Please take a minute to subscribe to our YouTube channel. My name is Ed D'Agostino from Malden Economics. Thanks for watching. See you next week.